It's a real pleasure to introduce the speaker for this hour, Brother Doug McClish. Brother Doug is, as most of these men are, personal friends, a friend of mine, have great respect and admiration for Brother Doug, his wife. Doug preaches for the congregation in Pearl Street in Denton. He's the director of the annual Denton Lectureship. Very effective lectureship conducted in November of each year. Dub is, let's see, is it Doug or whichever? There was a letter written to Dub not too long ago, last year sometime, that says, "Dear Doug," and this is kind of a private joke. Dub has done a lot of writing for nearly all of our periodicals. He's well known for his biblical stance and the proclamation of the gospel, for his stand for biblical truth. He is a graduate of Freed-Hardeman College, received his BA in Bible from Abilene Christian College in 1959, has done some graduate study, has done local preaching work in Idaho and Alabama and Kentucky and New Mexico, as well as several towns in Texas, Wichita Falls, Iowa Park, San Angelo, San Antonio, Granbury, and Denton. And he began his work with the Pearl Street Church in Denton in 1980, and he conducts gospel meetings all over the country, having gone to some 13 states or more in that capacity. He's spoken on many of our Bible lectureships, our college programs across the country, and speaker on most of the major congregational lectureships, such as this one that we have here. He's spoken on several occasions at our graduation exercises of the Brown Trail School of Preaching. He's a staff writer for the Restorer, member of the editorial staff of the Firm Foundation, and has articles appearing in many of our Brotherhood papers. He's directed or taught in Christian camps in 4 states, conducts radio programs, and for the last 4 years has been the director of the annual Denton Lectures. He's going to be speaking to us today on a really vital subject, truth and doctrine, centered around the text of Galatians 1, verses 6 through 10. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Brother Doug McClish.
Boy, I'm tired after hearing that introduction. I didn't realize I was so busy. You wonder how a man as young as I am could have preached in so many places. It's easy when you preach only a year at each one of them. The rest of that story that Eddie told a little bit of about how I was addressed in a letter several months back, on the outside of the letter was something like Doug McClish or Duck McClish, or sometimes I get them other terms too, dumb and so forth. And it was from somebody who knew me, of all things, Brother Perry Cotham, in fact. But he addressed me a different way on the inside address, and then started out with his greeting, "Dear Bob." So, I've been called a little of everything, and those are some of the best ones. I am indeed delighted to be here today and to have this opportunity to address you. I consider it a genuine honor to be invited to speak on this program. It has meant a great deal to me through the years. I know it has to all of us here and to many, many others throughout our great brotherhood, and will continue to for years through the books and tapes and videotapes. This year's lectureship book in particular should be a treasure as far as a reference work is concerned. These exegetical studies will surely call us back time and time again to open this lectureship book. There's no epistle in the New Testament that begins more abruptly than the Galatian letter. None is more frankly and plainly spoken as it launches on its major course of correcting problems in the Galatian church. No brethren in the first century were more directly and boldly reproved and called to account for the direction they were going. Now, it's true the apostle writes correctively and plainly to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians, but at least after his greeting, he does commend them briefly in verses 4 through 9 of the first chapter. Not so with the Galatians, however. After his very strong apostolic identification of himself and a brief greeting and doxology, he launches immediately a frontal attack against the fickleness of the Galatians and the source of their problem. The first major section of this epistle provides the tempo and tenor of the entire letter. Galatians 1, 6 through 10 is that particular first section. If you have your Testament, I hope you will not only turn to it and read with me, but that you will keep it open, because we'll refer to these verses time after time. I marvel that you're so quickly removing from him that called you in the grace of Christ unto a different gospel, which is not another gospel, only there are some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven should preach unto you any gospel other than that which we preached unto you, let him be anathema. As we have said before, so say I now again. If any man preacheth unto you any gospel other than that which ye received, let him be anathema. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still pleasing men, I should not be a servant of Christ. Let's look at the verses now here and see what we can lead out of them, for indeed that's what an exegesis is. Unable to repress or mitigate his concern over their impending apostasy, Paul says, I marvel concerning it. The word for marvel here expresses wonder, amazement, and surprise, but lurking beneath it may also be the implication of sorrow, disappointment, and maybe even some righteous indignation. He was so surprised and disappointed. There are two reasons. Number one, that they would radically change their convictions, and number two, that they would so rapidly apostatize. The word for removing here is a present tense form, and it's in the middle voice, which is significant. It has the significance of, ye are removing yourselves. This indicates, first, that the apostasy is not yet full-blown. It's still in process. And it also indicates that they were doing it on their own, or doing it to themselves. They were under no coercion or compulsion. They had no one to blame except themselves. The very term that is translated removing is noteworthy. It means essentially to transpose, and it was used by classical Greek writers to refer to a military or political defection that a traitor would make to the enemy. The rapidity of the change of conviction in the Galatians is indicated in the phrase, so quickly removing. Now, some understand quickly to relate to the time of their conversion. Others relate it to the last time that Paul visited them. The third, and I believe correct view, understands the term to be used in a positive way rather than in a relative way. Thus, Paul is expressing his amazement that so rashly, readily, and recklessly, after a new teaching has been introduced, they're already taking it up. Reminds me of some contemporary brethren. A passing reference to the fickleness of the Galatians is appropriate. All of the major commentators will mention this in the course of their introductions to the book and the commentaries themselves. This was a dominant trait of the Gauls, which were the original inhabitants of what is now France, but who had removed themselves over to Asia Minor. Galatia was named after them when they settled there. Although Paul had seen his share of those who could be easily swayed by every wind of doctrine that came around, as he wrote to the Ephesians in chapter 4, he exclaims, as it were, over the Galatian defection, I've never seen anything like you, brethren, in my life. They were swiftly moving to their new doctrines from something from him that called you in the grace of Christ. The Galatians were called of God through Paul's gospel, just as the Thessalonians had been, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. Time after time in the New Testament, although one of the apostles may have been the instrument, although some other preacher may have been the instrument, although the gospel may have been the instrument, God is stated to be the one who calls men out of the world and into the church. John Eadie says in his Greek commentary, their defection was all the more sinful as the calling was of God that they had answered. They were called in the grace of Christ. That is a prepositional phrase modifying the call of God they had received. Perhaps Paul is in this early passage of the letter identifying the great distinguishing trait of the different gospel for which they were falling. That in which they were called by the false teachers was in law alone, marked by ritualistic works of a dead and defunct system. Thus, the grace of Christ in which they were called would be automatically surrendered if they sought to be justified by the law. Paul makes that so plain in Galatians 5 and verse 4. Ye who would be justified by the law are fallen from grace. Their calling and standing in the grace of Christ was being surrendered and exchanged for what he calls a different gospel. Different is heteron in the Greek, which means distinction of kind, such as in our word heterogeneous. This negates any resemblance between the different gospel and the gospel of Christ in verse 7, that is, the true gospel. Thus they were removing not merely to another gospel, as the King James has, but to, as J.R. Dumelow says, a pretended gospel of a different kind from mine that is false. Then in verse 7, Paul talks about a different gospel, or another gospel, lest his reference to a different gospel be possibly misunderstood as a concession that the false gospel of the false teachers had some validity. He immediately adds, which is not another gospel. Another is a different word in the Greek, and it should be so distinguished in the English as the American Standard Version does. It's from allo, meaning additional or besides. By use of these two words, it is clear that Paul uses the word gospel accommodatively with heteron in verse 6, as the false teachers were wont to so dignify their heresy, but he uses it in its literal meaning in verse 7 with allo. With biting sarcasm and a play on words, then, Paul thus debunks the spurious doctrines that had captured the fancy of the Galatians. The only sense in which the new message among the Galatians was a gospel was in a perverted sense. The literal reading of the negative phrase rendered only, some would pervert the gospel, is except. That is, except in this sense. This is the only sense in which it is a gospel, in that it is an attempt to pervert the one true gospel, as A.T. Robertson explains it. The false teachers were a source of trouble to the brethren. Trouble is a present participle indicating that the factionists were still actively working among the Galatians when Paul wrote. The word used here by Paul is the same word Luke used to describe the troubles or the troublers or the rabble-rousers in Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17 that drove him to Berea. Now there's an indefinite pronoun used, some trouble you. Such an oblique reference may mean that Paul was not aware of the specific names of the troublers, or it may indicate that he simply did not want to give them unnecessary credence or notoriety by naming them. In either case, we can rest assured that Paul did not neglect to name them because it would have been unkind or because he was too timid to do so. He shrank not from doing that time after time in the New Testament epistles he wrote. And further, he commanded faithful saints everywhere and every time to do the same thing. Romans 16, 17, and 18. He says the troublers were perverting the gospel of Christ. Perverting the gospel was not merely the effect of their work, though. It was the aim and desire of their work. For the root of the word some would pervert you, thelontes, translated would, means first to be resolved or determined or to purpose, and then to desire or to wish. That simply means that these were not innocent and ignorant men preaching untruths that they simply had not learned, as was the case with Apollos in Acts 18 in Ephesus. But these were men who knew better and deliberately preached error for the sake of racial, traditional, and party loyalties, or perhaps, as the Judaizers were doing on the island of Crete, Titus 1 says, for the sake of filthy lucre. Pervert means reversing, or to reverse, converting into its opposite. These teachers were converting these Galatians into a doctrinal system just opposite to the true gospel, therefore. Verse 8, to further emphasize the essentiality of maintaining the absolute purity of the gospel, Paul now proposes an inconceivable hypothesis, and it's composed of two equally improbable elements. He introduces these two elements with a strong adversative condition, literally, but even though, and then states the conditions, we are an angel from heaven, etc. This but even though adversative has the significance of granting that the impossible might occur. The first improbability is that we should preach a different gospel. Some believe that Paul may have been using a literary or editorial plural here, but most understand Paul to refer to himself and his companions who were with him when they first preached the gospel among the Galatians in this pronoun. The second and even stronger improbability in this verse is that an angel from heaven should preach a different gospel. Now, this is no fallen angel that has been kicked out of heaven for his misbehavior or rebellion against God, but this is an angel from heaven, from the very throne of God, which means that he would be a messenger of God, for so from heaven requires. How could Paul have more forcefully emphasized the immutability of the gospel than to declare that neither its foremost spokesman on earth nor a direct messenger from heaven could alter it without condemnation? Paul and his companions preached the gospel truth unto the Galatians on at least two visits previous to this letter. Those who would preach to them a message which goes beyond or is contrary to, ASV margin, the gospel first preached among them were not God's servants, but his enemies. They were therefore anathema, literally devoted to destruction. Verse 9. Because this verse reads so similarly to verse 8 and refers to a previous warning of the same kind, it is generally assumed by the English reader that it is but a repetition for the sake of emphasis. However, there are two factors indicating that Paul is not referring in verse 9 to what he has just said in verse 8 when he says, "So say I now again." First, as Kenneth West comments, the compound verb here, have said before, and the words, and now I say, point necessarily to an earlier time in contrast to the present. The word now, RT in the Greek, excludes any reference to the words just written down. This suggests an already existing danger and also the fact that Paul had warned the Galatians against the Judaizers even before the latter had made their destructive inroads, unquote. Second, his change of pronouns indicates he's referring to something besides what he's just written in verse 8. He reminds the Galatians that we, Paul and his associates, we believe, had previously warned them of just such teachers and doctrines. But now, by his own apostolic authority, he personally reminds them, "So say I now again." Because of the earlier warnings of apostate teachers these Galatians had received, their defection was all the more inexcusable in Paul's mind. Paul had warned them before these Judaizers even got there, in other words. And now he's warning them again since they are there. Little wonder Paul was amazed and aghast at their apostasy. These Galatians had not only had the gospel faithfully and truly preached to them, they had hospitably and warmly received it. For so the word paralabete, the word for received here, connotes. Now they were welcoming and embracing a contrary message. The condemnation of verse 8 is again assigned to the teachers of the pseudo-gospel by Paul in verse 9. Although on the surface verses 8 and 9 appear to be, and for the most part are parallel, it is noteworthy that there is this distinction. Verse 8 suggests a double hypothesis that is inconceivable. Verse 9 describes what was actually occurring. The teachers were on the field and teaching a different gospel. Brother McGarvey sums this up well in verse 9, or what verse 9 says. Quote, "The strong wording of this entire passage forms a solemn warning against the sin of corrupting the gospel. All offices, appearances, and reputations to the contrary, whosoever perverts the divine truth is an enemy of Christ and rests under the curse of God." Unquote. Now there may elsewhere in the New Testament be warnings of tampering with Holy Writ that approach the severity of Paul's warning here. But I challenge anyone to find one that surpasses it. Now verse 10. The question had apparently been raised by the Judaizers in Galatia as to Paul's consistency and sincerity. He answers such a baseless accusation vehemently. "For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men?" Some of the same sort of teachers in Corinth had charged Paul with being over mild when he was present or when he wrote them, but being over bold when he was writing from afar. 2 Corinthians 10, 1 through 11. It may be that Paul is even actually quoting some of the false teachers in these questions he raises. Seeking the favor of men and striving to please men, the two phrases involved. Whatever specifically prompted the two rhetorical questions, they powerfully call attention to Paul's undivided allegiance to Christ. Would one who is trying at all costs to please and serve men ever make such statements as he had just written, assigning all gospel perverters to the anathema of God? Indeed, such strong statements would doubtless displease and offend some, especially those false teachers and their disciples. In this way, Paul both disproves and denies the accusations. Let it be noticed that Paul is not denying that he cares anything at all for the gracious thoughts or evaluations of his fellow men. He was human, and like all of us, we like to hear praise more than censure, do we not? He is emphasizing, on the other hand, the true principle that loyal service to God will sometimes, if not often, bring reproach from men, even friends, relatives, and brethren. The true servant of Christ will not draw back from serving Christ in order to obtain the plaudits of men or to avoid the attacks of men. James McKnight said it well. "This is a cutting reproof of all those preachers who either alter or conceal the doctrines of the gospel for fear of displeasing their hearers or to gain popularity." Unquote. If Paul's denial here were not enough, he points to the fullest demonstration of whose servant he truly is as he closes the letter in chapter 6, verse 17. "Henceforth let no man trouble me, for I bear branded on my body the marks of Jesus." Who could rationally argue with the long scars of the rods and the scourge across his back? Who could debate with the disfigurements left by the stoning he received at Lystra? Were these incurred to increase his power and popularity among men? Oh, yes, the apostle cared for the cordial friendship of saint and sinner, Jew and Gentile, but he would never compromise principle or practice to court or curry it. In the statement of this principle of loyalty to Christ at all costs, Paul forever exposes the weak and shallow disciple who will not even be inconvenienced, much less suffer for Christ's sake. More so, Paul's statement and example heap a mass of rebuke and exposure upon the hireling time servers in pulpits who are more proficient at licking boots and playing religious politics than they are preaching the gospel fully and faithfully. To maintain popularity and position, often with a most generous salary, some have made an art of preaching only on things calculated to please the weakest saint in the pew. Such know just how to preach enough against sin in general without ever being specific to cause anyone to feel guilt. They've learned the science of being non-committal on controversial and unpopular topics. They've learned how to preach some truth without preaching any blatant error. But you'll hear little or nothing from them that would distinguish them from the denominational preacher down the street. Were Paul resurrected among us, he would not last 2 weeks in the pulpits they now occupy, and these soft preachers would be the first ones to speak out and prate against his uncouth, harsh, negative, and offensive words in their judgment. A true servant of Christ such as Paul is blind and deaf to what men may say, do, or think when truth and righteousness are at stake. Christ must be pleased and served at whatever cost. Now the next section, since we have finished the actual exegesis, I'm going to skip. It's in the book and you can read it there. For time's sake, we're going to move on to some further current applications. The religious world that claims to believe in Christ in this modern age falls squarely under the curse of Galatians 1, 6 through 10. The pronounced fickleness of the Galatians in matters of doctrine and morals appears to be a universal affliction of man. Only a few generations after the perfection of Eden, man had removed so far from God that he was not worth preserving, except for Noah. Not many generations after the ark's righteous inhabitants made a fresh start, the human race had again become so corrupt that God called Abram aside and promised through him and his eventual seed that his plan for relieving man of the curse of sin would be accomplished. Although God gave the family of Abraham through Jacob incomparable blessings and a written law for the first time, their history is one of repeated, almost perpetual apostasy and rebellion. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, Galatians 4 and verse 4. That humanity-blessing seed of Abraham so long ago promised, Galatians 3:16. And he, the Christ, that seed, established his church by the preaching of the gospel of his atoning blood. Although the safeguard of inspiration of the apostles and prophets protected first the preached and then the written word of the gospel from error, it is evident in the very teachings of the gospel message that men would not long be content with the will of God through it. Many of the Jewish converts could not accept the Gentiles without binding parts of the Mosaic law upon them, as was the Galatian problem. Some had erred from the truth on the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15 and 2 Timothy 2. Some on the second coming of Christ, 2 Thessalonians 2. And others on matters of morals, 1 Corinthians 5 and various other things. Warnings of doctrinal error and proponents of same are scattered generously through the New Testament, appearing in almost every book thereof. Uninspired church history after the apostolic age is rife with accounts of men's departures from the way until the full-grown apostasy produced a religious monstrosity in the Roman Catholic Church that was unrecognizable as the church when compared with the New Testament record. The abuses and errors became so egregious in that body that some from within its own ranks arose in rebellion, and in the 16th century produced the Protestant Reformation. Within 2 centuries, the Reformation had so badly failed to bring men back to Christ and the truth that men arose from within the Reformation declaring we must have a restoration. By the mid-19th century, the restored church could claim 300,000 or more members in our sparsely populated and undeveloped at that time republic. Just when it would appear that perhaps a worldwide restoration of the New Testament church might become a reality, that a man by some within its ranks for more than the gospel allowed or for less than the gospel required carried a significant number of churches and brethren once more into apostasy. Surely, this thumbnail sketch of man's religious history amply demonstrates man's universal proclivity to depart from truth and righteousness as seen in these Galatians. Not only does man speedily embrace false ways, there are always those who seem ever ready to serve as the devil's agents in leading others away from the truth. Jesus warned of such false prophets in Matthew 7:15 and of the blind leaders who would lead other blind persons to their destruction. Matthew 15, verse 14. Some will lead others astray for gain. 1 Timothy 6, 1 through 5. Others, such as the false teachers in Galatia, were apparently doing it in order to uphold tradition and justify blind prejudice. But whatever the motive, those who tinker with the authoritative truth of God are troublers of the innocent, and they turn the truth into a message of errors by their perversions of it. That portion of the world that claims to believe in Christ is now hopelessly divided because men have departed from the gospel in so many ways and for so long that even the most fundamental facts of the faith are now openly denied as important among them. Paul's judgment upon false teachers, whether human or angelic, applies without regard to office, wealth, prominence, popularity, power, or influence, or any other factor. In order for some measure of credibility to be lent to their claims, some false teachers have indeed claimed an angelic revelation, such as Joseph Smith, the pseudo-prophet of the Mormons. Such a claim is rendered absolutely false by Paul's censure in verse 8. In fact, even if an apostle should try to lead some astray, as Paul said, if we should teach you differently, or as Peter once did in Antioch, Galatians 2 verse 11, he too would be accursed. He who would wrest the Scriptures does so to his own destruction. 2 Peter 3 verse 16. Surely Paul's proscription applies to so many men today in the religious world in general who have perverted the gospel of Christ. Sadly, the gospel perverters have become a major affliction in the body of Christ once more. By the middle part of this century, the Lord's people had largely made up the losses sustained by the defection of the previous century and had again become the fastest growing religious body in America. Man's fickleness began to be observed once more, however. The cry began to be noised abroad, we've been too harsh, we've overemphasized doctrine, we've been too negative, etc. The very distinctive militancy that had been so much responsible for rapid yet stable growth began to disappear. I well know what a temptation toward positivism this siren call was back in the early to mid-1960s, for I was a young and inexperienced preacher at that time, to whom some of these things sounded very plausible and inviting. I was made to feel considerable guilt because of my hard preaching for a little while there, until I figured out what was happening and what the end of all of that direction would be. We're now living to see what the end of that direction is, brethren. The more this fixation on super salesmanship and positivism became apparent among us, and the less the cutting edge of the plainly worded gospel truth began to ring from our pulpits and papers, the less we began to grow. We entered an era in which it almost became a sin to expose sin, and at whatever cost to the truth, none in the pew must ever be offended or left with a feeling of guilt. In a 20-year span, we've gone from a point where almost every Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and whatever knew what we stood for and despised us for it, to a point where they can see little, if any, difference between most of us and them. The things some of them were doing 25 to 30 years ago and we were exposing, such as building gymnasiums and specialization of ministries and unscriptural fundraising and unity and diversity and giving incentive prizes for attendance, and you increase the list as long as you arm, many of our brethren are either now doing or they see nothing wrong with doing them. None can deny that the church has changed in the past quarter century and is yet in a state of rapid flux. Why is this so, brethren? There is only one way the church can change or be changed. The message has changed, and a different gospel has been preached and is being preached. True, this changed message is attracting some because it provides an air of emotional excitement, an aura of self-assurance and well-being, even for the grossly sinful, and a social, physical program that's the envy of the YMCA. But is this God-given or humanly contrived growth being produced? A swelling church and a growing church may well be, and usually are, separate entities. If great numbers of people are evidence of God's blessing, then the huge independent Baptist churches, such as those at Hammond, Indiana, and Lynchburg, Virginia, can present a more credible case for pleasing God than can any of us, for either of them is several times larger than our largest congregation. The problem with the growth at any price practice is that the price is always too high. We must never forget that whatever we do to attract people is what we must continue to do to keep attracting them. If people are attracted by a wholly positive message, they'll become distraught to the point of leaving when the negative aspects of the gospel must be proclaimed. If they are fed with and attracted to a wholesome balance of all elements of the gospel, true growth will come therefrom. This was the basis of our growth 25 years ago. Although none of our congregations were as large then as several now are, I dare say that the church was stronger then, far stronger, brethren. Men and women and even children knew what they believed, and they knew why they believed it. By contrast, so many who have become members of the church in recent years, especially among the larger, rapidly swelling congregations, have become such with hardly the vaguest idea of who or what they are religiously. Many of them have been dunked in water after some 15 to 20 minute quickie conversion tactic that was sprung on them, and they bit it. As more and more of those who are not grounded in the faith become our elders, our deacons, and our preachers, and our teachers in the classroom, more and more congregations must inevitably drift further and further from the truth. Just as inevitably, somewhere in the not-too-distant future, the time will come once more when those who have reveled in the changed message and its fruits, and those who are determined that no man or angel will ever make them swallow a perverted gospel, must part company. History need not repeat itself, brethren, but it probably will in this respect, as sad as it is to contemplate. What shall we do about these matters? We must first remember whose servants we are and whose pleasure we seek. We serve not men but Christ, Galatians 1:10. We must also never forget that a faithful and loyal service to Christ can be measured only by our careful handling of His pure Word. To reject His Word is to reject Him and bring judgment upon ourselves by that very Word, John 12, verse 48. Therefore, to faithfully handle His Word is to faithfully serve Him, and to be a workman who needeth not to be ashamed, 2 Timothy 2:15. Further, we must never allow the pressures of men to silence the truth, be those pressures from gangsters, from civil courts, from relatives, from dear friends, from respected elders, or from fellow preachers. We must remember that the very curse of God rests upon all who dare tamper with His Word, and we must determine to represent it loyally in our words and deeds wherever we go and with whomever we are. In such a course alone is there hope both for ourselves and for those who hear us. 1 Timothy 4, verse 16. Thank you. Please notice I gave you back 2 minutes this year.
Thank you, Bob. Doug. Dub. These are very serious matters about which we must be so very deeply concerned. Some wise advice, observations from the great chapter 1 of Galatians. And we must not be as the ostrich and stick our heads in the sand and hope that these situations will go away, because they need to be met with the truth in love, but nevertheless the truth in all of the truth. We appreciate these comments by Brother Dub this morning.